Before the world knew his voice as the Word, they knew his hands as the work. Before he broke the bread for 5,000, he broke the silence of the darkest nights. These are the narratives the scrolls left behind, the moments when the Son of Man faced the primal architecture of human evil. Part 1. The Sepulchre of the Grain Storage, the Jerusalem INN. When I was 15, Jerusalem was not just a city of prayer, it was a labyrinth of shadows. I took a position as a night watchman at a sprawling caravanserai near the Damascus Gate. Owned by a family friend of my father, Joseph, the structure was a monolith of limestone and cedar, its walls saturated with the scent of 1,000 years of dust, roasting lamb, and the metallic tang of hidden secrets. My duty was simple: guard the stores, watch the gates, and ensure the guests, mostly merchants and weary pilgrims, slept undisturbed. The night that changed my soul began with a heavy, oppressive heat. Marcos, the master of the inn, handed me a bronze key and pointed to the double locking system of the storage vaults. "The top iron bolt is for the Romans," he said with a grimace, "but the bottom wooden slider is for the ghosts. Never leave the slider open. Joshua, the wind in this city has teeth." Marcos and his wife, Diana, were attending a feast in the upper city, leaving me to watch over their 5-year-old son, Charlie. I tucked him into his bed on the second floor. His room was a small, square space with a high window that looked out toward the Temple Mount. In the corner sat a massive, waist-high clay pithos, a grain jar, used for storing the winter wheat. As I placed a flickering oil lamp on the stone ledge, I felt a sudden, sharp drop in temperature. Charlie whispered, "Joshua, something is scratching inside the jar." I laughed, a sound I hoped carried more courage than I felt. "It is only the mice dreaming of bread, little one," I replied. I checked the jar. It was filled to the brim with grain. I closed the heavy wooden lid and retreated to the hallway, leaving the door slightly ajar so the yellow light of the oil lamp could bleed into the dark. 40 minutes later, a soft pat-pat-pat of bare feet on stone echoed through the corridor. Charlie was there, his face as pale as the moon over Gethsemane. The lid moved. "Joshua," I saw it shift. I led him back, my hand resting on the small dagger I carried for protection against jackals. I opened the grain jar again. It was exactly as I had left it. I pushed my hand deep into the grain to prove it was solid. Nothing. I tucked him back in. But this time, I sat in the shadows of the hallway, watching. 15 minutes later, I heard it, not a scratch, but a long, slow creak. I stood up and looked into Charlie's room. The lid of the grain jar was now resting on the floor. My heart didn't beat, it throbbed. I walked into the room, my sandals silent on the limestone. Charlie was sitting up, his eyes fixed on the narrow, 6-inch gap between the massive grain jar and the rough-hewn wall. He pointed a trembling finger. I followed his gaze. In that darkness, pressed so tightly into the space that it seemed his bones must be cracking, was a man. He was crouched like an insect, his skin the color of wet ash. He wasn't moving, he wasn't breathing, he was simply there. I saw the edge of a ragged tunic, a bruised shoulder, and then, the eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and filled with a void that no lamp could fill. I didn't scream. I had learned early that fear is a language the darkness speaks fluently. I lunged, not for the man, but for Charlie. I scooped him up in one motion and backed out of the room, my eyes never leaving those of the intruder. The man didn't chase us. He stayed in the crevice, as if he believed he was still invisible. I ran. I bolted down the stairs, threw open the iron gates, and screamed for the night watch. When the soldiers arrived with torches, the room was empty. The grain jar was overturned, wheat spilling across the floor like a golden shroud. The wooden slider on the back door had been pried open from the inside. I realized then that the man hadn't entered that night. He had been there for days, living in the architecture of the house, watching the family eat, watching the child sleep. He was a silent guest, a predator who lived in the spaces between the walls. That night, I didn't just learn about locks, I learned that evil does not always break in. Sometimes, it is already there, waiting for the lamp to go out. Part 2. The Reaper of the Joppa Gymnasium, the blood on the track. By the age of 17, my hands were calloused from the stone quarries of Joppa. To earn extra shekels, I took the midnight shift at a Greek-style gymnasium near the harbor. It was a place of marble and hubris, where soldiers and merchants came to sculpt their bodies in the image of pagan gods. My task was to maintain the oil vats and the torches. The gymnasium was a cavern of echoes, on a night when the sea mist was so thick it swallowed the lighthouse. A man entered. He didn't use the bronze seal of membership, he simply appeared. He was a traveler from the east, or so I thought, with matted hair and skin that smelled of salt and decay. He went to the circular running track, a path of rough-cut limestone. He began to run. I watched him from the shadows. His pace was inhuman. He didn't run with the grace of an athlete, he moved with a mechanical, violent urgency. 10 minutes passed, 20, 30, he never slowed. His breathing was a low, rhythmic growl that harmonized with the crashing of the waves outside. I approached him to offer water, but I stopped 5 paces away. The air around him was freezing. Then, I looked at his feet. He was barefoot, with every strike on the jagged stone. His flesh was being shredded. The white marble of the track was being painted with a dark, thick crimson. He was running on raw bone, yet his face remained a mask of stone. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, and his mouth was locked in a silent, jagged gasp. "Brother, stop," I called out. "You are destroying yourself." He didn't turn. In a voice that sounded like grinding millstones, a sound that vibrated in my very marrow, he muttered, "Are you there?" He wasn't asking me, he was asking the void. I realized then that this man was a vessel of the Legion. He wasn't running to train, he was running to escape a tormentor that lived inside his own blood. He was a prisoner of a kinetic curse. I reached out to grab his shoulder, but as my hand neared his skin, a spark of spiritual static threw me back. The man stopped instantly. He didn't decelerate, he became a statue. He turned his head, not his body. Just his head, 180 degrees until he was looking directly at me. His eyes were black pits. "The son of Joseph has arrived." The voices within him hissed. He lunged. He didn't move like a man, he moved like a landslide. I grabbed a heavy wooden training staff and braced myself. We struggled in the dark, the scent of his blood filling my lungs. I didn't fight to kill, I fought to bind. I pinned him against a marble pillar and whispered the secret names of the stars. The man let out a shriek that shattered the oil jars nearby. A black mist poured from his mouth and vanished into the sea air. He collapsed, his body finally finding the rest it had sought for 1,000 miles. I spent the rest of the night washing the blood from the marble, knowing that the runner was merely a herald of the legions I would one day face on the hills of Gadara. Part 3. The Tall Guest of the Judean Hills. When I was 21, the year before the Spirit led me into the wilderness, I stayed with my sister's family in a small village nestled in the Judean Hills. She had 2 children, Emma and Lucas. One night, while she and her husband were away at a wedding in Bethlehem, the silence of the hills became a predator. Emma, who was 6 and prone to visions, came down to the kitchen where I was sharpening a tool. "Joshua," she said, "why did you come into my room and tell me to be quiet?" I looked at her, my heart slowing. "I have been here by the fire, Emma, I have not moved." Then Lucas came down, rubbing his eyes. "Joshua, you were standing by my bed. You were so tall, why didn't you say anything?" A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air settled in my chest. I knew my sister's house. It was built into the side of a limestone cliff. There were crevices and old burial caves that the foundation had bridged over. I grabbed a blacksmith's hammer, the only weapon I had, and led the children back upstairs. I told them to stay behind me. I walked into the upper hallway. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and old linen. I saw him then. Standing in the doorway of Emma's room was a figure that defied the architecture of the house. He was nearly 7 feet tall, his head brushing the cedar beams of the ceiling. He was impossibly thin, his limbs like the branches of a lightning-struck oak. He wasn't wearing clothes, but a shroud of gray, translucent skin that seemed to ripple like water. He was looking at the children's empty beds. I stepped forward, the hammer heavy in my hand. "This house is under my watch. I said, my voice dropping into that deep, resonant frequency that I would later use to calm the storms. The figure turned. He had no nose, no hair. His mouth was a wide, vertical slit. He didn't speak. He leaped. A sound, a high-pitched whine that made the children cover their ears. He raised a hand, his fingers unnaturally long, and mimicked a peek-a-boo gesture. It was a grotesque mockery of human play. They are so soft, the creature whispered, the words forming directly inside my mind. I didn't wait. I charged. The creature moved with a fluid, liquid grace, retreating not toward the door, but into the wall itself. He slipped into a crack in the limestone as if he were made of smoke. I didn't stay to investigate. I grabbed the children, wrapped them in their heaviest cloaks, and ran into the night. We fled to the house of the village elder, a man with a heavy door and a sanctified threshold. The next morning, we returned with the village men. Behind the wall of Emma's room, we found a hidden chamber, an ancient tomb that had been forgotten for centuries. Inside were the remains of a giant of old, and the floor was littered with the small toys and trinkets the creature had stolen from the children over the months. He hadn't been a ghost, he was a remnant, a lingerer, who believed the house was still his grave. The chronicles you have heard today are a tapestry of the silent years, those 18 winters between the temple and the Jordan where Joshua walked as a man. While these narratives are woven with threads of fiction to create a seamless journey into the macabre, they are grounded in the profound truth that the ancient world was a place of deep, terrifying shadows. We tell these stories not to distract from the light, but to remind you that the light was forged in the presence of the dark. The missing years were not spent in idle silence, they were spent in the trenches of human experience, facing the same predators, physical and spiritual, that still roam the corners of our world today. Subscribe to join our congregation of the curious. Strike the bell to be alerted when the next scroll is unrolled. Comment below. Do you believe some guests never leave a house? Walk in the light, but keep your lamps trimmed and burning. The night is long, and the watcher is always near.